The show Game of Thrones has a plethora of derailed character arcs, but for my money, the quickest and earliest derailment we saw, at least of a major character, was that of Sansa Stark. In Season 5, her story entirely diverges from what happens in the books. In the show, she's married off to the Boltons, which is something that Peter would probably never do if he were acting like himself or just a person at all, but the writers needed that to happen, so it happened. In the books, Sansa's story is quite different. Today, I'm going to go over her story in the most recent books of Song of Ice and Fire, as well as the one chapter we have from her perspective in The Winds of Winter, and what I think is going to come for her in the next two books in the Song of Ice and Fire series. I'm Quinn the GM, and welcome back to Winter is Coming. Before we get into discussing Sansa herself, I think it's important to discuss a larger concept to the story as a whole that I think very much affect her arc more than many others, that being the 5-year gap. Many individuals, myself included, have spent a lot of airtime talking about this. It's the idea that Martin initially intended to have a 5-year gap take place between A Storm of Swords, the third book in the series, and what was then going to be the fourth book in the series, A Dance with Dragons. This would allow certain characters to essentially undergo 5-year training arcs and kind of get them into their finalized versions of themselves. Arya would spend time with the House of Black and White, Bran would be tutored by Bloodraven, and Sansa would be in the Vale, being tutored by Littlefinger in politics. All three of these characters were very much hurt by the exclusion of this gap. Sansa is one of the most hurt by this exclusion, as I think her role in Feast and Dance is greatly diminished because of this. So, if we're getting into Sansa's story, it's important to look at the main kind of inflection point of her journey thus far, that being the Purple Wedding. She is indirectly kind of half responsible for Joffrey's death, seeing as assumedly the poison was carried in her hairnet, according to a prophecy we'll discuss a little bit more later. After that, she is kind of whisked away by Peter Baelish, Batyr, if you're reading the audiobook, and the two of them go to the Vale with her Aunt Lysa, who Peter pretty promptly murders because she's going crazy and likely to kill Sansa. Peter has this kind of fixation on Sansa. Half the time he's treating her as a daughter, half the time he's treating her as a love interest. It's very strange, but overall it leads to this kind of protective dynamic as Peter has essentially taken over the role as her protector, at least so far in the story. And hey, if you enjoyed this video and want to know more about what's coming in the Winds of Winter, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. It's free and it really helps support the channel, and I just really appreciate it. And a bunch of my viewers aren't subscribed, so just make sure you are if you can. Thank you. Back to video. I'm bad at plugging. This is what I mean by the 5-year gap negatively impacting Sansa with its removal. If we look at A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, the two most recent books in the series that cover a combined timeline, she is tied with her brother Bran for the prestigious title of the viewpoint character introduced in the first 3 books, with the fewest chapters in both of them. This is specifically egregious for Sansa, as her chapters are in A Feast for Crows, and then we don't hear from her at all in A Dance with Dragons. She has just 3 chapters in A Feast for Crows, and we haven't heard from her since 2005, save for one sample chapter, which I'll discuss in a little bit. But overall, it has led to Sansa really feeling as though she's been on the back burner for the last little bit. One of her chapters in Feast is, I think, the longest or second longest in the series history, so that sort of makes up for it, but she really has been just not present for most of the recent history of the series. So what happens in Sansa's chapters in A Feast for Crows? Well, she becomes not Sansa Stark. She begins posing as Alayne Stone, and her chapter titles change one chapter into A Feast for Crows to reflect this. She's posing as Littlefinger's low-born daughter, as there is a lot of suspicion swirling around Sansa Stark, given her very conspicuous absence in the immediate aftermath of the Purple Wedding. This puts her at least partially in the eyes of the realm for a candidate for having committed regicide alongside her husband, Tyrion Lannister, so it does very much seem like a good idea for her to stay out of public sight for a while. This results in her kind of dyeing her hair, changing her appearance, and essentially changing the way she thinks about herself. We see Arya do something similar across the Narrow Sea, insofar as she's kind of changing her identity for the Faceless Men, though Sansa does seem to have more of a concrete grip on herself outside of that, rather than Arya, who is just kind of completely melting into Mercy or Cat of the Canals at points. At this point in the story, Sansa serves as our main viewpoint on Lord Peter Baelish, Littlefinger, one of the most fun schemers to watch in the entire series. My favorite part of her arc in A Feast for Crows is seeing Peter's confrontation with the Lord's Declarant. This is a group of lords in the Vale who claim that Peter has no right to rule over them, as he is an interloper and just kind of an upjumped, not lowborn, but close to lowborn lord, who just seized control because Robin Arryn is still too young. Robert Arryn is his true name in the books, but people still call him Sweet Robin. This whole group of Lords Declarant come up the mountain. It is a big part of the early Sansa story in A Feast for Crows, and we see that unlike just the three of them coming up, as happened in the show with Sansa, this whole group comes and confronts Peter specifically about Lysa's death. However, Peter has specifically engineered this to go in his favor. One of his men, Sir Lyn Corbray, is posing as one of his most bitter foes. He's with this group and he draws steel in this parlay, which is a massive no-no, and a lot of people are very kind of hyperactive about guest right in the immediate aftermath of the Red Wedding. This, essentially, confrontation and sudden violent turn leads to Peter having the advantage in this situation, and the Lords Declarant grant him a 1-year period to essentially just abdicate his rule of the Vale, set things in order for Robin, and then dip. The next portion of Alayne's story involves the departure from the Eyrie. This castle is very well fortified, but it does come with the downside of being pretty much inaccessible during winter, which is coming according to Sansa's house and this video series. So essentially they depart the Eyrie, this massive fortress of the Arryns, to go down to the Gates of the Moon. That very long chapter I mentioned earlier is this journey down. It's quite interesting. We get a lot of insight into a number of characters in the Vale who seem to be fairly interesting political players in this instance of intrigue we have here. Most notably Miranda Royce, one of the daughters of the Lord of the Gates of the Moon, Lord Nestor Royce. She seems to be at least partially on to Sansa, especially given the fact that Sansa blurts out Jon Snow's name when Miranda mentions the Night's Watch having a new Lord Commander. So overall, it seems as though both Nestor and Miranda will have something to do with the undoing of Peter's schemes and Sansa's involvement in them in the Winds of Winter, though how exactly that'll take place does remain to be seen. Sansa's story in A Feast for Crows, and thus in the published material of A Song of Ice and Fire, ends with Littlefinger explaining his plan to her. Specifically, that she is to eventually reassume her identity as Sansa Stark, thus making her the key to the North. As far as Littlefinger knows, Rickon and Bran Stark are dead, Robb Stark died at the Red Wedding, and Arya went missing. So really the only candidate to take control of Winterfell is Sansa Stark. Specifically, he plans on marrying her to Sir Harold Harding. Harry the Heir, for whom my cat is partially named. He's actually named after Harry Styles because he was my sister's cat initially, but I digress. Harry the Heir is a cousin to Sweet Robin and essentially serves as the kind of backup protector of the Vale should something happen to this very, very sickly boy. So it sounds like Peter's plan is to somehow induce Sweet Robin's death and then marry the new heir to the Vale to Sansa Stark and bring both the Vale and Winterfell under his control, as well as technically the Riverlands, since he is the Lord of Harrenhal. As mentioned earlier, Alayne does have one chapter that has currently been released from the Winds of Winter, and it's one of my favorites of the sample chapters. It's not the best, it's not the Forsaken, which is one of the best pieces of writing that Martin's ever put out, but it is quite interesting. It lays the groundwork for this massive, intricate set piece that we are going to get probably pretty early on in the Winds of Winter, that being the Tourney of the Winged Knights. This is a massive, massive tournament that is going to be essentially a lot of different knights from the Vale coming together and essentially creating what seems like almost a Kingsguard for little Robert Arryn. This is based on the stories that he loves of the Winged Knight, and it was Sansa's idea to be able to kind of create this order of Winged Knights in order to just better protect him. And it seems as though Littlefinger will be seizing the opportunity to just claim some hostages and keep Harry the Heir close, first and foremost. We're introduced to Harry on page for the first time in this chapter. He's kind of a douche, and that's not surprising, but this chapter also does a great job of setting up some other individuals who I think are likely to be unlikely heroes in the next chapters, specifically going forward from the Tourney of Winged Knights, one of which is Sir Wallace Waynwood, this guy with the stutter. I think he's going to succeed, and I think that's just kind of in line with Martin's writing style to have this unlikely character maybe beat the mean Harry the Heir. Before we get into more concrete speculation on the Winds of Winter, we need to discuss a prophecy that pertains to Sansa that is quite important to her role going forward. In Arya's story in A Storm of Swords, she meets a woods witch known as the Ghost of High Heart, who spouts a bunch of prophecies, many of which immediately come true, like the Red Wedding, and one about the Purple Wedding. Specifically, she says something that we can very clearly ascertain is Sansa. She states that, quote, "I dreamt of a maid at a feast with purple serpents in her hair, venom dripping from their fangs. And later I dreamt of that maid again, slaying a savage giant in a castle made of snow." Which I think is fascinating. The serpents in her hair are a very clear reference to the poison in her hairnet that was taken during the Purple Wedding and used to kill Joffrey. I think that killing a giant at a castle made of snow is a very clear indication. Castle made of snow seems to signal Winterfell more than anything else, and I think that overall killing a giant could mean a number of things, but most likely that would be Littlefinger. It is pretty obvious, but most of the Ghost of Highheart's prophecies are, as Littlefinger's sigil is a giant, and Sansa might have cause to kill him if he in some way betrays her or tries to use her or makes another advance that she really doesn't like. This next section's a little bit interesting. It has to do with an outline that was recently unearthed from early in Martin's drafting process for Feast for Crows, back when this timeline was combined with A Dance with Dragons, so all characters were involved. This outline is not necessarily writing, it's not chapters or sample chapters or anything similar, it's just rough notes on what he wants each character's story to be as it progresses in just the overall grander narrative. It would be worth noting that these could be considered spoilers for the Winds of Winter. Personally, it seems like maybe he'll semi-follow this guideline, but I doubt it would be one-to-one, especially given how much time has passed. This is, at this point, over 20 years ago. Jesus Christ. But there are two specific references to Sansa in these notes. One that does happen in A Feast for Crows, as we already have it, and one that seems to be an outline for her story going forward into the Winds of Winter, further than I think pretty much any other character in this book. The first note is pretty simple, and as I mentioned, already happens in the published works. Sansa, Divide Chapter, Littlefinger, Cersei is overreached. She'll soon be done. This is a conversation that happens, I think, late in one of Alayne's chapters in A Feast for Crows. Peter essentially goes into this entire tirade on his plans. He thought that Cersei would self-destruct, but had no way to anticipate how quickly it would happen, so he's just surprised that she is just going through this all so quickly. He expected to have 5 years. It's actually kind of the most meta reference to the 5-year gap we have in the series. It's a fun little line, and it's cool to see Martin thought of it this early as a little bit of an explanation for why things are moving quicker than he thought. The other note about Sansa is much more general, much more broad, and it spans a much greater reach of time. Specifically, it says, Sansa, old, resolved to be Sansa Stark, SS, and take north. 1. Tourney of Winged Knight. 2, which is crossed out, Sweet Robin woos, or weds, it's hard to tell. 3, which is also crossed out, news from White Harbor. 4, kill the mouse. These are quite interesting, and I think each of them do have some indication on where exactly her story is going in the Winds of Winter. Winds of Winter, not Wings of Winter. I'm talking too much about the Winged Knights in this video. So the Tourney of the Winged Knight is the first thing we hear. We have, before that, the kind of resolution to be Sansa Stark and take the North. We got that a little bit with Littlefinger's plan at the end of her story in A Feast for Crows, but we've yet to reach Sansa actually resolving to do that herself. So I think that'll be a big kind of watershed moment for her looking forward in the series. Next up is Sweet Robin woos or weds. This could indicate that maybe Sansa is not going to wed Harry the Heir, but might instead wed Sweet Robin, which would be quite interesting. Given the fact that there is so much speculation around Sweet Robin dying in the story, it does make it seem like he probably won't, given the fact that Martin tends to not like to have things that are directly speculated on come true exactly as his characters are planning. News from White Harbor is also quite interesting. White Harbor is where Wyman Manderley was currently planning to retrieve Rickon from Skagos. So the thought might be maybe she hears that Rickon is back from White Harbor. There's also some thought of a wedding taking place there in these early drafts, so it could be that as well. That wedding is supposed to be Arya's, so maybe she hears of Arya's wedding. That would be changed if that were the case. And the last one is also interesting. Kill the mouse. Late in Sansa's story in A Feast for Crows, we have Sir Shadrach the Mad Mouse appear at the Gates of the Moon. He's a very interesting character who pops up in Brienne's chapter earlier on, as he is also searching for Sansa Stark at that point. He still seems to be searching for her, and he's found her, unlike Brienne in the books. So it seems as though he is going to try to do something with her, and that could result in his death. Kill the mouse. I don't know if it'll be Sansa herself killing Shadrach, but that would be very interesting to see. It's unclear, and overall it'll be interesting to see if/how any of these things play out in the Winds of Winter. Brief sidebar, well, it's not official. I think that Preston Jacobs' Alayne chapter from his Winds of Winter fanfiction is a pitch perfect rendition of how I think the Tourney of the Winged Knight is going to go. A lot of things going wrong. I'm sure that different things will go wrong in the post material, but I would very much recommend checking it out. I will link to it in the description. It's one of my favorite chapters they've done. I think that first bullet point really encapsulates what Sansa's arc should be in the Winds of Winter. She, at this point, is hiding. She is Alayne Stone. She is concealing who she truly is. Her story in the books begins with the death of her direwolf. Lady is killed to pay for a sin that she did not commit. This essentially represents Sansa killing her Stark heritage in order to blend in with those around her and not be killed by them. I think that the Winds of Winter for Sansa Stark is going to revolve around her reclaiming her true self, regaining her identity as Sansa, no longer being Alayne, and getting back to being the wolf that was killed so long ago. I'm very excited to see where Alayne's story goes in the Winds of Winter, not just because I'm a big fan of Littlefinger, but also because I think Sansa is one of the most interesting characters looking forward into the next book. She's always been my favorite of the Stark kids outside of Jon Snow, so I'm pumped to see her future. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. It's free and it really helps grow the channel and just generally makes me feel good. I'll have more videos about A Song of Ice and Fire and House of the Dragon in the very near future, so be sure to stay tuned for those. Thank you again so much for watching. I've really enjoyed all the support recently. It seemed like people have been liking what I've been doing, and it's always nice to see that. So again, thank you so much for watching. Goodbye, everyone.